Three. Hi, everyone. We are Robson Bittencourt and Susana Davalos, and today we want to discuss bilingualism and multilingualism in the context of education. We'll deal with identities, ideologies, and empowerment. Are you ready for this journey, Susana?
I sure I am.
Excellent. So, folks, in this presentation, we will offer a broad overview of some issues related to bilingualism and multilingualism, and as I said, particularly identities, ideologies, and empowerment. The main part of the presentation will be based on Fele Garcia's article, Multilingualism and Language Education. Garcia's article, as you will see, offers a historical perspective on different ideologies about multilingualism in education. Besides, it describes critical issues such as the stakeholders, who the stakeholders are in this debate, as well as different pedagogies and practices in the field. As we move on to current perspectives and future directions, we will also try to discuss our own critical views on the issue. To emphasize the importance of bilingual education, let us remind ourselves of this, which is a quote by the very Ofelia Garcia. Bilingual education is much more than a technique or a pedagogy. Bilingual education is education, and it is also a way of equalizing opportunities. It rests on principles of social justice and supports social practices and learning. On. Now, in this new section, we will go over some historical accounts on the issue. Understandably, the development of language education programs on multilingualism is largely dependent on the historical period. So let's look first at the so-called colonizing ideologies. Before the 20th century, folks, speakers of languages other than English, also called lotes, they were viewed as colonized minorities, expected to fail in English education due to their perceived inferior status. In the 20th century, for example, successful English-educated lotes were normally from high social classes, and they maintained their elite status and competence in their native languages, mostly English. The focus in this period remained on English monolingualism for industrialized nation building mostly, leading to the suppression of, for example, indigenous languages and a decline of multilingualism. Soon after, we have what's called critical ideologies. In the mid-20th century, scholars and policymakers in the language education field realized that monolingual education wasn't effective for minority communities. This occurred alongside a resurgence in ethnic identity in the 1960s, mostly, which challenged the notion of multilingual nation states. However, federally sponsored bilingual education in the US, for example, was primarily aimed at quick English acquisition. It did not recognize bilingualism and multilingualism. However, despite historical suppression, languages such as Welsh and Maori in the UK and New Zealand, respectively, saw revitalization efforts. Okay, subsequently, we see the resurgence of what's called nation-state ideologies in an emerging global world. With the Immigration Act of 1965, for example, the US experienced a rise in immigration, and therefore, bilingual contexts became increasingly multilingual. Despite initial tolerance, however, bilingual education faced immense obstacles towards the end of the 20th century, since some states prohibited bilingual programs in favor of English-only approaches like ESL. New ESL models emerged that focused on integration into the mainstream classrooms or structured immersion. Finally, we also see what's called neoliberal ideologies. From the 1970s, profit extraction from colonized populations who spoke other languages other than English, lotes, changed from imposition to manipulating market forces, therefore exploiting multilingualism without English-speaking societies for neoliberal expansion. Plurilingual education emphasizes language skills and practices, repertoires, highlighting the value of linguistic diversity. In the end, English acquisition remained crucial, always English at the center. Content and language integrated learning and dual immersion programs emerged as alternatives to traditional foreign language education. Now, let's turn to some critical issues in this matter, and I will turn the word to my colleague, the presenter, Susana Davalos. Susana?
Good evening, everyone. Well, talking about critical issues, the first point that we have is to talk about power and ideologies. One critical issue in this debate is the power and ideologies. As Garcia explained, the concept of power and who controls schools' impacts and education programs determines whose language is taught and which languages are valued and which are like a kind of minorized. It is true that some marginalized groups influence curriculum to support multilingualism. However, these kind of programs often encourage kind of monolingualism, especially in English-speaking contexts. Ideologies favoring monolingualism define language, considering some of them like a native and others as second languages. So this kind of groups make or reinforce like a kind of denominate of monolingual speakers and kind of marginalize bilingual contexts. Then we have the stakeholders that focusing in communities, parents, students, and teachers. So in this case, we need to consider that this kind of connection is really important because we know that language starts in communities and then goes to families, and then students bring that language to schools, and also teachers need to manage that kind of situation in order that to create that bilingual environment and to adapt to the reality of their students. Then we have the pedagogies and practices. So in this case, we have different approaches that we are going to go through. In this case, for example, we have the grammatical approach, communicative approach, cognitive approach, language enrichment, and of course the assessments. That is the way how we evaluate and how we know or range the level of a language.
Finally, we also have assessment, which is another issue of paramount importance. One problem here are obviously the standardized texts, so many of us are familiar with, that often don't adapt to the so-called stakeholders that Susanna just mentioned. These tests, they are predominant, especially in English speaking education, and they fail to accurately assess multilingual students' language skills and content knowledge. They overlook the diverse language practices of bilingual students and often distort the assessments. This often distorts the assessments. Again, educator Garcia advocates that we should reimagine language education and address these power dynamics, taking stakeholders into consideration. Now, again, we are moving on to a next section that was prepared by Susanna, where she will discuss, most in more details, the different pedagogies for multilingualism. Susanna, can you talk more about the so-called grammatical approach, communicative, cognitive, and also finally the language arrangement? Very excited to hear what you say about that.
Thank you, Robson.
What is the
Well,
grammatical approach?
the grammatical approach, I will say that is like a kind of the dinosaur approach. So it was like a kind of the first approach or the first method that all teachers use inside of the classroom. The typical thing that apple is manzana, you know. So and the main thing here is just to translate words from Spanish to English and not really focusing on structure or pronunciation. And then we have the direct method that focusing more in going through the language like directly, as its name already says. So focuses more in studying the patterns of the language. And then finally, we have the audiolingual method where students practice patterns, but at the same time practice dialogues that improve a little bit more speaking. So, but at the end, all these three methods only like focus on a structure, on grammar structure.
You know,
So
the
no more
ironic
else.
thing is that this dinosaur is still alive. Even the real dinosaurs that were extinct like millions of years ago, the audiolingo approach is still there and prospering and selling books and making a lot of money. All right,
Yeah.
that's interesting. What about you had quite an interesting summary. What about the communicative approach?
Well, in this approach, we like move forward to the new century, to new dinosaurs.
Yeah,
So in this case, as it name says, we focus more on how we use language to communicate ourselves. Let's remember that the main purpose of a language is to communicate, not use just random words, because otherwise we are not really speaking a language. So yeah.
nice.
And then we have the cognitive approach, that this approach, I really love it because here we have the connection between what the student think and the language. So in this case, the student must to be conscious about what they are learning it
Yes.
and the purpose, why they are learning, the benefits, and so on.
I'm personally attracted to the idea of how we can integrate cognitive process, the way you think and the way we speak, and how we have to be conscious of these things, especially as adult learners. It's quite interesting. Finally, language arrangements. I'm curious about that.
Well, in this case, as you can see on the screen, the main focus of this arrangement, but talking about like all approaches or all background, that was that a student shouldn't be used two languages inside of the classroom. That, okay, you are going to teach English and you don't have to speak Spanish at all in your class. Otherwise, you are going to confuse your students and they are not going to be able to produce the language. But sometimes we need to be like kind flexible in this context, because there are moments that students really need like to make this kind of comparison between their mother tongue and the foreign language they are learning.
Which
So
is
it's a
something
kind
that
of exchange.
something
Yeah.
we have been discussing and listening
Mm-hmm.
a lot to in class. I think as we immerse ourselves also in this new course, in this master's degree, I think one of the great things I have been learning is how to value the students' repertoire and
Yeah.
use it as a resource, not as a problem. So it seems like language arrangements go against that idea,
Mm-hmm.
right? Lovely. I think this is beautiful way that you've been showing that to us, Susanna. Uh, let's move on to uh, language bilingualism and language education programs. As you can see, there is a glitch in the PowerPoint. But anyways, so some of these issues are being redefined. Language and bilingualism obviously are not static systems. They are rather dynamic strategies for social interactions that are exposed to social, cultural, and political factors, and they keep changing. So one model that has been used a lot recently is what's called the translanguaging. Translanguaging emphasizes that language practices are flexible systems, flexible selections, challenging those static language boundaries. Another term that comes here is polylingualism or even metrolingualism, which always highlights the idea of dynamic language change. Language education programs in themselves are also redefined. Um, the traditional language education programs, they keep evolving and they are being redefined. One example are the dynamic plurilingual education programs, which focus on the existing language practices of students. This helps to integrate them throughout the day in order to scaffold English development. In this way, students can control their language usage and help shape their education. So the stakeholders, the students, are part of shaping their own education. However, and there is always a however, standardized tests, again, they continue to have difficulties assessing this dynamic bilingualism in an efficient manner. Another issue is that language standards emphasize the integration of language skills and practices, which boosts innovative assessment approaches, hopefully. So all of these innovative ideas and debates we are bringing forward here, they are very promising and they give hope that the issue of bilingualism and multilingualism may be addressed more positively in the future. So considering that, we move now to a final section where Susanna will read a couple of quotes by Garcia regarding future directions.
Yeah, according to Garcia, multilingualism and education will remain a challenge because of most educational systems are organized by nation states, which continue to extend their power and influence by manipulating language in ways that benefit them exclusively. So she adds that if fruitful bilingual and multilingual education programs and practices are to be developed, education systems must transform reflecting the interests of the nation state to sustain learners, notably the children who, through their dynamics language practices, have to make sense of their increasingly multilingual world. So it's really important not just as teachers to be aware of the importance of being bilingual and being aware of this multicultural world, but it is of course a very important job that needs to start from our governments.
Right. Wow, that was great, Susanna. I think you really wrapped up and with a very insightful quote by Ofelia Garcia. And I hope you had such an exciting journey as mine as in this work. We both discussed this before, and I'm sure that we are both, more knowledgeable or at least prepared to deal with the issues ourselves. Are you ready to take these ideas and use it in your teaching practices, Susanna?
I'm ready to try it. I'm not sure if I will be successful, but I'm ready to try it.
That's a good perspective. Lovely. Thank you so much, Susanna. You have been an incredible companion in this journey. And I loved doing this work and learning and exchanging ideas with you. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Robson. I really enjoyed to sharing this space with you, and I hope those people that are watching this video and find this research helpful and useful for their teaching as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, folks.
Bye bye.